What if a single speech could silently erase a political giant from the landscape of power, not through volume or rage, but through surgical precision and institutional authority? Here's the uncomfortable truth that most Americans missed. In Washington, political careers don't typically end at the ballot box. They end when the right person grants permission for the ending to begin. When the most powerful Republican in the Senate approaches the podium, financial markets adjust their positions. Mega donors recalibrate their investment strategies. The invisible architecture of political power shifts on its foundation. And that's precisely what transpired when Mitch McConnell delivered his speech. And almost no one recognized what was actually unfolding before their eyes. At first observation, it appeared to be just another political feud, another headline destined to be forgotten by the next news cycle, another soundbite to scroll past on social media while eating lunch. But if you listen with the trained ear of someone who understands how power actually operates in America's capital, the tone revealed something entirely different. This wasn't anger speaking. This wasn't emotion bubbling over into public view. This was cold calculation, surgical precision, strategic deployment of carefully weaponized language with meticulously chosen words and deliberate pacing. McConnell didn't attack Donald Trump in the conventional sense. He did something far more lethal to a political career. He demonstrated to the entire Republican establishment how to move forward without Trump, how to evolve past him, how to survive in a post-Trump political landscape. Because what happened in the days and weeks following that moment has the potential to reshape entire election cycles, fracture long-standing political loyalties, and determine which candidates even receive the opportunity to compete for the highest offices in the land. Stay with me through this analysis, because once you see the mechanical workings behind this pivotal moment, once you understand the strategy embedded in every sentence, you cannot unsee it. The machinery of power will become visible to you in ways it never was before. If you believe Mitch McConnell walked to that Senate podium fueled by spontaneous anger or personal frustration, you've already fundamentally misunderstood the man in the moment. Mitch McConnell doesn't do public emotion. He doesn't freelance. He doesn't snap under pressure and say things he later regrets. Every single word he delivers on the Senate floor is the carefully crafted product of strategic planning, precise timing, and long-term political calculation. His career has been built on this foundation of disciplined control. That's precisely why this speech landed with such devastating force. It wasn't a reactive outburst. It was pre-planned, pre-written, workshopped with key advisors, and held in reserve, waiting for the exact right moment in the political calendar to be deployed for maximum impact. In Washington, speeches of this magnitude and consequence don't happen unless the speaker has already conducted extensive behind-the-scenes consultation, unless they've already mapped out where. The political ground will settle after the explosion, unless they've already secured enough support to survive the inevitable counterattack. What made this particular moment genuinely explosive wasn't the content of what McConnell said, though that mattered enormously. It was how he constructed and delivered the message. There were no personal insults, no raised voice echoing through the Senate chamber, no dramatic rhetorical flourishes designed to generate applause or viral video clips. Instead, McConnell spoke the precise language that moves real power in Washington, the language of institutions, procedural rules, constitutional obligations, and systemic consequences. That stylistic choice was absolutely deliberate, and it reveals McConnell's deep understanding of how political influence actually operates. Emotional attacks create momentary headlines, but fade quickly from memory. Institutional arguments, however, embed themselves in the permanent record. They create precedent. They establish frameworks that shape future decisions. By framing his entire case in procedural and legal terminology rather than personal grievance, McConnell wasn't engaging in an argument with the general public or Trump's passionate base. He was speaking in a coded language directly to senators sitting at their desks, to major donors managing multi-million-dollar political portfolios, to party lawyers who understand constitutional law, and to power brokers who recognize that in Washington, process isn't bureaucracy, process is power. This speech was never designed to trend on Twitter or generate passionate cable news debates. It was engineered to move the heavy machinery that operates behind closed doors, the machinery that actually determines political outcomes. And here's perhaps the most critical element to understand about McConnell's strategic thinking. He would never burn a major political bridge unless he had already constructed an alternative road to his objectives. His entire four-decade career has been built around two core principles: preserving and expanding Senate institutional authority and winning elections for Republican candidates. Personal relationships, individual politicians, even presidents, these have always been secondary considerations for McConnell. For years, he tolerated extraordinary chaos, unprecedented norm-breaking, and constant controversy because it served a larger strategic purpose: maintaining Republican electoral success and Senate control. But this speech signaled something that should send chills through anyone paying attention to the mechanics of American politics. The calculation had fundamentally shifted. The cost-benefit analysis had been rerun with updated data, and the conclusion was clear. The political cost of remaining aligned with Donald Trump now definitively outweighs any remaining benefit. When a man who has built a legendary career on counting votes with ruthless accuracy, who survived and thrived through decades of shifting political winds, decides to go this publicly on the record, it means one thing: the math has changed. And in politics, once the math changes, everything else inevitably follows. The dominoes begin to fall in predictable patterns. In the complex ecosystem of political power, silence is rarely a neutral position. It's actively enforced through fear, incentive structures, and calculated consequences. For years, through two impeachment proceedings, through January 6th, through countless controversies that would have ended other political careers, many Republican senators maintained public silence, not because they privately agreed with everything happening, not because they felt no concerns about the direction of events, but because speaking out carried severe career-threatening consequences. Primary challenges funded by Trump-aligned groups, loss of crucial campaign funding from major donors following Trump's lead, public backlash from an energized base that viewed any criticism as unforgivable betrayal. The punishment for dissent was swift and severe. What Mitch McConnell accomplished with his speech was the quiet dismantling of that fear structure. He didn't issue demands. He didn't tell senators what they must think or how they must vote. He did something far more sophisticated and ultimately more powerful. He showed them it was safe to think differently. He demonstrated that expressing concerns wouldn't automatically end a political career. And that distinction, subtle as it may seem, changes everything. Power in Washington doesn't move when someone attacks a dominant figure. Power moves when someone with sufficient institutional authority signals that the underlying rules of engagement have changed, that the cost-benefit analysis looks different now, that new pathways have opened. This is what political operatives and scholars call creating a permission structure. Before this pivotal moment, criticizing Donald Trump openly was viewed as political suicide within Republican circles. It meant isolation, funding cuts, primary challenges, and potential career termination. After this speech, criticism became a viable career option, a path that ambitious politicians could consider without assuming it would end in political destruction. McConnell didn't demand that senators transfer their loyalty from Trump to himself. That would have failed immediately and looked transparently self-serving. Instead, he offered something more valuable: protective cover, by stepping out first, by making himself the initial target, by absorbing the first wave of backlash. He took the most dangerous position. He drew enemy fire so that others following behind him would face diminished resistance. That's why the speech wasn't loud, theatrical, or designed for television clips. It was calm, measured, and deliberately understated, because the target audience wasn't voters watching at home. It was senators sitting at their desks in the chamber, chief of staff sitting in offices watching C-SPAN, operatives and strategists observing carefully and thinking, if McConnell is willing to do this, if he's calculated that this position is sustainable, maybe I can consider it too. Once that thought enters the political ecosystem, once it begins circulating through private conversations and strategic planning sessions, everything fundamentally shifts. The dam holding back dissent doesn't break all at once in a dramatic collapse. It cracks slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, senator by senator, statement by statement, vote by vote. Some will speak out publicly, making headlines and giving interviews. Others will change how they vote on key procedural questions, sending signals without explicit statements. Some will simply stop actively defending Trump, creating space through strategic silence. But the ultimate result remains the same: progressive isolation of the previously dominant figure. Political power depends almost entirely on the widespread belief that you're untouchable, that crossing you carries unacceptable costs, that your influence is permanent and unchallengeable. The moment that belief begins to fade, the moment doubt enters the equation, influence collapses with shocking speed. McConnell understood something crucial that many political commentators missed. Ending a dominant political career doesn't require a dramatic public takedown. Sometimes all it takes is one sufficiently powerful institutional figure standing up and calmly saying to the rest of the political class, "You are allowed to leave now. The exit door is open. You won't be destroyed for walking through it." By framing opposition as a matter of constitutional duty rather than personal desire or political ambition, McConnell created a psychological escape hatch for Republican lawmakers who've been privately uneasy for years, but lacked a safe way to express those concerns. And here's the quiet brilliance embedded in this approach. This procedural framing changes how voters process and interpret the message as well, not just how senators justify their positions. Instead of hearing a messy, emotion-driven political breakup, which would trigger defensive reactions from Trump's base, voters hear what sounds like a sober, reluctant decision forced by larger principles. That tonal shift lowers psychological resistance. It introduces doubt rather than outrage. It plants questions rather than hardening positions. Once voters begin encountering phrases like constitutional eligibility, procedural precedent, and ask institutional obligation rather than personal attacks or emotional criticism, the entire narrative framework shifts. The story stops being about loyalty to a person and starts being about legitimacy of candidacy, about whether the system itself can accommodate a particular path forward. And legitimacy questions are everything in democratic politics. They operate at a deeper level than preference or enthusiasm. McConnell understood intuitively that if you want to end someone's political dominance, you don't frontally attack their supporters. That only strengthens tribal bonds. Instead, you give those supporters a dignified reason to reconsider their position without feeling foolish or disloyal. You offer an exit ramp that preserves their self-image. And that's precisely what this legal and procedural framing accomplished. It didn't demand immediate agreement or conversion. It invited gradual acceptance of a new framework for thinking about political choices. By framing opposition as a matter of constitutional duty rather than personal desire or political ambition, McConnell created a psychological escape hatch for Republican lawmakers who've been privately uneasy for years, but lacked a safe way to express those concerns. And here's the quiet brilliance embedded in this approach. This procedural framing changes how voters process and interpret the message as well, not just how senators justify their positions. Instead of hearing a messy, emotion-driven political breakup, which would trigger defensive reactions from Trump's base, voters hear what sounds like a sober, reluctant decision forced by larger principles. That tonal shift lowers psychological resistance. It introduces doubt rather than outrage. It plants questions rather than hardening positions. Once voters begin encountering phrases like constitutional eligibility, procedural precedent, and ask institutional obligation rather than personal attacks or emotional criticism, the entire narrative framework shifts. The story stops being about loyalty to a person and starts being about legitimacy of candidacy, about whether the system itself can accommodate a particular path forward, And legitimacy questions are everything in democratic politics. They operate at a deeper level than preference or enthusiasm. McConnell understood intuitively that if you want to end someone's political dominance, you don't frontally attack their supporters. That only strengthens tribal bonds. Instead, you give those supporters a dignified reason to reconsider their position without feeling foolish or disloyal. You offer an exit ramp that preserves their self-image. And that's precisely what this legal and procedural framing accomplished. It didn't demand immediate agreement or conversion. It invited gradual acceptance of a new framework for thinking about political choices. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this pivotal moment is that Mitch McConnell knew exactly what would happen next and consciously chose that outcome anyway. He knew the attacks would be brutal and personal. He knew the insults would be vicious. He knew that Trump and his most loyal supporters would unleash everything in their rhetorical arsenal. He knew the headlines would scream betrayal, that talk radio would denounce him, that his social media mentions would become toxic. And that predictable backlash was actually part of the strategic plan. In leadership politics, particularly at the highest levels, sometimes the most powerful tactical move available is deliberately drawing fire onto yourself so that others operating in more vulnerable positions don't have to absorb that damage. McConnell didn't accidentally stumble into backlash. He strategically positioned himself directly in its path. That's not weakness or miscalculation. That's sophisticated leadership strategy executed with clear eyes about the costs. By stepping out first, by making himself the most visible target, McConnell absorbed the initial political shockwave that would have otherwise hit dozens of vulnerable Republican senators simultaneously, instead of every Republican in competitive districts facing immediate pressure to denounce or defend Trump. The anger had a single focal point, and that focal point was the Senate's institutionally powerful but electorally safe majority leader. This tactical choice creates crucial breathing room for others in more precarious positions. Senators in swing states can remain strategically quiet, avoiding forced positions on explosive questions. Those representing deep red districts can afford to wait and watch how the situation develops. No immediate statements required, no forced loyalty tests in the heat of the moment. McConnell essentially became a political lightning rod, a buffer zone between the angry base and the rest of the Republican caucus. It's a classic leadership move that only works if executed by someone with enough institutional armor to withstand the incoming fire. And McConnell has spent 4 decades building exactly that kind of armor. He doesn't face competitive elections in Kentucky. His fundraising network is independent and deeply established. His institutional position provides enormous protective benefits. Here's why this tactical choice is particularly devastating for Donald Trump's political future. Trump's power has always relied on rapid, widespread retaliation, flooding the entire field with pressure so that no individual feels safe breaking ranks, creating the perception that dissent will be met with overwhelming, immediate consequences. McConnell's strategic move disrupted that entire dynamic by isolating and containing the conflict. He slowed the momentum. He prevented the geometric spread of pressure. Attacks concentrated on one institutionally protected man can't destabilize an entire caucus. The way attacks spread across dozens of vulnerable members can. They concentrate anger instead of multiplying it. And once that anger stops spreading geometrically, once it's contained in a specific location, fear begins to weaken throughout the broader system. This is how political influence quietly erodes, not through dramatic confrontations, but through strategic containment. McConnell didn't attempt to defeat Trump in a direct shouting match or popularity contest. He changed his battlefield so that shouting no longer determined outcomes. What most voters and casual political observers never see is the quiet side of politics, the side without rallies, without chants, without viral social media clips. While cameras focus on crowds and television networks chase dramatic moments, real structural power often moves in private dining rooms, in closed-door fundraising meetings, in quiet conversations between candidates and the people who finance modern campaigns. And long before McConnell delivered his speech, Those rooms were sending increasingly clear signals. Major donors, institutional financial backers, and long-term Republican strategists were growing deeply uneasy. To this class of political actors, politics fundamentally isn't about loyalty or emotional excitement. It's about winning elections, maintaining stability, and generating return on investment. These are people managing political portfolios worth tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. They think in terms of risk assessment and strategic allocation. By the time Mitch McConnell spoke publicly, many of those donors had already begun quietly stepping back from Trump-aligned causes. This is the kind of pressure that rarely generates headlines, but shapes outcomes more than almost anything else. When major donors hesitate or redirect their resources, campaigns feel the impact immediately. Advertising budgets shrink, recruitment of top-tier staff becomes difficult. Strategic planning freezes because future funding is uncertain. Data operations and ground game infrastructure, the unsexy but crucial elements of modern campaigns, begin to deteriorate. McConnell understood that the Republican Party couldn't continue moving forward effectively while carrying a political figure that donors increasingly saw as a liability rather than an asset. Electoral losses in races that should have been winnable. Constant controversy making fundraising conversations difficult. Unpredictable messaging creating uncertainty about future positioning. All of these factors have made fundraising harder, not easier. And in American politics, when money becomes harder to raise, everything else becomes harder to accomplish. So this speech wasn't merely political theater, it was financial signaling. It reassured the people writing the largest checks that party leadership was finally willing to course correct, that they recognized the problem, that investments in Republican causes wouldn't be wasted or undermined, and that financial reassurance is what makes this moment so potentially damaging for Trump's political future. Grassroots enthusiasm can fill rallies and generate impressive television coverage. But enthusiasm alone doesn't replace the sophisticated infrastructure required to win national elections. Modern campaigns run on expensive foundations: data analytics, legal teams, media buying, opposition research, and complex logistical operations. All of that requires substantial, sustained funding. When institutional leadership signals that money is moving in different directions, ambitious candidates notice immediately, experienced consultants notice, and political ambition, which drives so much of what happens in American politics, follows resource availability. McConnell didn't need to convince Trump's base voters overnight. That would be impossible. And he was smart enough not to try. He only needed to signal to the financial backbone of the Republican Party that it was safe, even advisable, to invest resources elsewhere. Once that signal gets received and acted upon, political gravity shifts with remarkable speed, and it very rarely shifts back. This speech, represents something that historians may look back on as a genuine turning point. Not because it immediately ended Trump's influence, it clearly hasn't, but because it started machinery moving that becomes very difficult to stop once it builds momentum. McConnell demonstrated that one powerful institutional figure, speaking at the right moment with the right framing, could open pathways that previously seemed closed. He created permission structures that allow ambitious Republicans to imagine political futures that don't center on Trump. He reminded everyone that institutions, when they finally decide to protect themselves, possess enormous resilience and power, that the Senate, with its rules and procedures and traditions, can resist even the most popular presidents when it chooses to. Most importantly, he demonstrated that political power isn't primarily about crowd size or enthusiasm. It's about control of infrastructure, money, procedural leverage, and the subtle signals that tell ambitious politicians where opportunity lies. Trump doesn't have to lose his base to lose his political future. He merely has to lose enough of the system, ballot access, funding streams, institutional endorsements, procedural advantages, to make winning become impossible despite the enthusiasm. McConnell understood that ending a political era doesn't require defeating a leader head-on in direct confrontation. It requires cutting off the pathways to transform popularity into actual political power. This speech didn't end anything overnight, but it started a clock. And once institutional machinery begins moving in a new direction, once the financial architecture shifts, once ambitious politicians see new opportunities emerging, momentum becomes very difficult to reverse. The speech that almost no one truly understood may be remembered as the moment when American political power quietly changed hands, not through an election, not through a dramatic scandal, but through one calculating institutional figure deciding the moment had come to give permission for a new era to begin.